Thank you all for joining us here today for this panel discussion on COVID-19 and supply chain shocks. Can circular economy principles and models build resilience? We had a little bit of a technical issue because of which we were slightly delayed in beginning, but I think we're all sorted now and we can hear all our panelists. Before we go any further, I'm Pavitra. I'll be your host and moderator for today. What we're going to do is just make sure that all our panelists have their video on and all the non-panelists have their videos and off and their microphones mute. Immensely to keep things smooth. Okay, so big thank you to the EU-REI team for putting this center together and for helping us to run it and for all the support. This webinar is brought to you by EU-REI and Infinitive, and an amazing and a very distinguished panel that's got some very other perspectives on the economy and resilience it is when it comes to supply chain. Before we begin, can I also ask everyone to mute themselves? I'm hearing a little bit of background noise. I'm going to stop with that now. And Rachna, can I invite you to introduce EU-REI and set the context for today's panel discussion?
Yeah, thanks, Pavitra. Thanks to all the participants for joining in from different parts of the world. And I think this is, as Pavitra mentioned, second in the series. And what we would like to do is not bore you off by presenting something similar on what EU-REI is and what we have been doing, because I think all of you both know about it pretty much, because we have been quite active in India since last 3 years. We would just like to share brief information related to, especially in context to the topic for today, and then just leave a lot of time and space for our panelists today to share the details and information that they have to. So, yeah, Aditya, if you can just go next. Yeah, so I think with regard to the resource efficiency, circular economy discussion, a lot of is about material consumption in India per capita, as well as related to the resource productivity in India in general. So I think the largest drivers are, of course, the urban middle class, the higher rates of consumption, urbanization, as well as a lot of primary extraction of resources like for bauxite and copper and other material, which still remains to be primary rather than just trying to foster secondary resources in it. So, of course, with regard to those kind of production volumes, they're actually kind of exponential growth that we see. And these are the scenarios that we did was like, of course, before the COVID. So this is also something looking on the change that is happening. And I think that's why the discussions today and the further ones that we are planning would actually give us also contextualization of what experts in the field think about the raw material demand and the exponential growth, and how exactly could resource efficiency play a role. So I think what is important is to note is the scarcity, the issue of critical raw materials, where, of course, if you can just go next, with regard to the price shocks that we think about. And since, especially for critical materials, and when we talk about local production, Atmanirbhar Bharat in India, a lot of these materials are not available in India. We have been import dependent, and I think that's just across in a lot of other countries as well. But I think the 97% of the material which is still extracted domestically is there, but the high dependence on critical raw materials makes us vulnerable as an economy. And I think that's where we could think about the discussions as and when, like during this discussion as well. We just go next. Yeah, that's a brief shot of just in one slide of what the EU Resource Efficiency Initiative is. We have TERI, like the consortium is led by GIZ. We have TERI as a knowledge Indian partner, and CII, Congress of Indian Industries, and Adelphi as a German partner. And I think what we started to begin in the last 3 years was actually to have this dialogue, policy dialogues with the government, with the policymakers. With a lot of work that we did was largely focusing on assessments, scenario building, and looking at sectoral action plans. So a lot of numbers and studies that have come out are not an easy data, but at least they point out to what kind of material consumption patterns are we focusing on, and especially these studies that we did on 4 sectors related to mobility, construction, waste, uh, e-waste as well as plastics, and renewables largely brought out issues of criticality, brought out issues of the material demand in these sectors per se, and then the role of resource efficiency in secondary resources. Something that we as a project look at doing is adapting the EU standards, and that's where something we initiated with Indian and European partners is, for instance, adaptation of WEEE standard. And at the government level, at the national level, we have supported NITI Aayog to have a national strategy, as well as the Ministry of Environment to have a draft resource efficiency policy. Awareness and promotion is something that we anyways try to do quite a lot with different diverse sets of stakeholders so that these opinions do come out very clearly. And then you can also chart a discussion with the government, which is much more informed about it. And that's why we do a lot of hackathons, engagement drives like this, so as to just create this awareness around entrepreneurship opportunities, innovation, and business models which are existing in India. Then we also try to work at a state level where we supported the state of Goa to have a state resource efficiency policy. So that's largely a snapshot of the work that we do, and a lot of it is already available across on the channels that Pavitra mentioned. Just go next. So I think what has a declaration this year in 2020, it has been signed by the heads of the countries, and they're actually just looking at strengthening dialogue on both sides on resource efficiency, circular economy, which brings in a lot of aspect around innovation, capacity development, support to India on the G20 resource efficiency dialogue, as well as the upcoming BRICS summit, where India is also looking at putting circular economy as an agenda, and also looking at research and innovation as one of the priority sectors, both from EU as well as India on across learning. And strategic exchange on, especially on digitalization, as one of the key instruments to promote business models, best practices, available technologies in these areas. Just as few thoughts, and I think something that we have just across the board through a lot of discussions that's already happened on green recovery across. So I very recently found this B20 input that has been brought forward for the G20 as like a business group, B20 group towards the G20 discussion. And so I think the discussion that has largely happened is, of course, there are businesses, and we have some of them today to also talk about how people are actually innovated around compensating these shortages, supply constraints which are there on the supply chain, and also met the increased demand or try to adapt the reduced demand. So I think these are some discussion points which is really good to just see of how businesses have reacted. And across different discussions, I think what has been very clearly coming out is innovative businesses processes across product and services, supply chain risk, social innovation, role of an entire ecosystem creation, so that we have more of society involvement. And considering the pandemic, I think these are some of the key instruments to be considered as well. Then something that came out from the GRI summit, where at least I was involved in the circular economy dialogue, was about community-centric models. Again, social economy, social innovation, resilience, enhancing resilience in community, role of digitalization for upstream and downstream value chain for more transparency and the radical transformation that we are looking at. Support to MSMEs with regard to digital tools, onboarding with relevant services, with people-centered solution. I think this has also been key, and I'm sure Rene would address some of this in his discussion as well. Then I think related to the statements have also been around transparency, so that there's an entire supply chain visibility and more of building relationships both at a user as well as a generator level. I think this is one of the key things as well. Then with the B20 report, as I was just mentioning, this does talk about quite a lot about climate change and other issues. But yeah, I think unfortunately I didn't see a real clear input coming out from the B20 group to the G20 on resource efficiency, circular economy. But it does talk about global supply chains, especially addressing tariff and non-tariff barriers, localization, local production in India and other economies. So I think it's a good input for today, but I think I don't see that coming out from the circular economy. So there is a still, when it comes to understanding this issue, much more larger in context of B20 as well. And something that has happened very closely with our EU business support project is a COVID impact review, which is quite interesting. And this report is available. If any of you are interested, we can also put you in touch with the team, which actually talks about the role of EU businesses in India, especially on recovery process. So yeah, I think that's largely what I had to say in a big kind of just to summarize what we would be interested and just to set the context. So looking forward to the discussion. And, thanks. Muted for that.
Great. Thank you, Rachna, for that comprehensive but also brief overview. And I think a lot of the points that you've got on that last slide there, we're going to pick up in the discussion today. I'm just going to quickly introduce our panelists. We have a very, very distinguished panel here. We have Rene van Berkel, the India representative of UNIDO. He brings a wealth of experience working in areas of resource efficiency, cleaner production, working with SMEs across different geographies, but also now a lot of focus in India. And I've seen, at least lately, him talking a lot about Industry 4.0 and where that fits into the whole conversation, particularly with the manufacturing sector. Welcome, Rene. I request all the panelists to turn on your videos, please, so the audience has some context when I'm introducing you. Okay, we have David, who's the director of the European Remanufacturing Council, brings us a lot of perspective on remanufacturing and how that plays into the conversation on circular economy and resilience. Welcome, David. We have Manohar Samuel, who is advisor sustainability at Grasim Industries, part of the Aditya Birla group. And I think he's here to give us the business perspective, because we all always want to know, but what about the businesses, right? So he's here to give us the business perspective and with a lot of focus on the textile industry. Again, decades of experience in that industry. And he had some very interesting things to say to me before this conversation. We also welcome Vaibhav. I think Rachna mentioned community-centric models, and we said when we do circular economy, we're talking business policy, we leave community out. And Vaibhav runs India's first community maker space called the Makers Asylum, and he's going to be sharing perspectives on distributed manufacturing and some amazing work they've done in the wake of COVID. I mean, obviously before, but especially in the wake of COVID. And we also have Rashi, who is director at Banyan Nation. A lot of you must know Banyan Nation already. I know them as an organization, I think, that's really stuck to the guns of we are doing circular and closed loop recycling of plastics and, sort of kept aligned to that mission from a fairly early stage and still aligned to it today, I would think, at least from an external perspective. Welcome to all our panelists. We had some issues earlier, but I think we can hear you all quite well now, and that's all good. Okay, before we go any further, I just want to say to our participants that we're going to make this a conversation as much as possible. We don't have any more presentations. I think this is turning out to be a relief. Like all the panelists are like, yay, no more presentation. I don't have to make one. So I think we're going to stick that format. It worked well last time, but we'd love to hear your feedback at the end of today's session as well. I'm going to be asking questions, asking our panelists to jump in, and then you can participate as well by giving us answers to some of the poll questions. And also feel free to add your questions in the chat box. Since I mentioned poll questions, I feel the need to put one up right away. Naren is going to help with that, I think. Naren, can you flash up a poll question just to let you all know? The poll questions are just for us to get a pulse of what you're thinking. Clearly no right or wrong answers, and don't worry about your expertise in the area, right? It just helps us to dig deeper into certain areas. Naren, are we ready with a poll question?
Yes, just coming right up.
Okay. And to those of, okay, I'm going to let this poll question roll first. So I hope you can all see this up on your screens. In your current understanding, we're asking you, how strong do you think the link is between circular economy models and building resilience in supply chains? And we're asking you to say, is it proven to build resilience? Is it there may be some theoretical potential, but we need more evidence? Or is it, hey, there's no link? And I'm here to see what you guys have to say. Just have another 10 or 15 seconds, and then we'd love to see what you're thinking at this moment. And actually see if that shifts as the conversation goes along. All right, I think the poll has ended. Thank you for participating. No prizes here except knowledge. So with that, I'm going to let the results flash up in just a second. But to set some context for today, further to what Rachna has already said, COVID-19 has, placed significant disruption on a lot of aspects of our lives, with the businesses, particularly the supply chains. And we're on our way to building back what is hopefully a new normal. Where do resilience and circular economy fit into this conversation? And just a quick caveat that, supply chain, resilience, circular economy, all big words and ideas. So what we're going to do today is try and unpack them a little bit. We'll see whether circular principles and models build supply chain resilience. Is there evidence of that? Is there a business case? Do we have some concrete examples? If there's theoretical, theoretically, yes, this is a good idea, but then have we really seen, can we build a business case? And, what are some of the gaps we have to address? And what are some of the other ways in which circular economy and resilience link to each other? What that means, I'll come back to it in, later parts of the conversation. And one more framing that I think we want to keep in mind is that COVID has put us in what is hopefully a unique situation, right? This sort of scale of shutdowns across the globe. But we're not always going to have this, but we are going to have smaller disruptions, more frequent disruptions, right? And what lessons could we take away from this test bed that's been presented to us with COVID to apply more generally to business? So that's sort of which we want to have the conversation today. Taking a quick look at the poll results, I think what we see is overwhelmingly people saying that some circular models have theoretical potential to build supply chain resilience, but require more evidence and proof of concept. That's, I think, a sort of good place to start. Let's start maybe with Rene in understanding what has actually been the impact on the supply chain. So Rene, let me bring you in for our first question. You've done extensive work with SMEs in India. What's the impact and what sort of sectors are the most affected with these supply chain shocks?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting UNIDO as the Industrial Development Organization of the UN. We have been working on the MSMEs right from early days when the COVID lockdown started, and we took kind of stock of what are MSME issues. And I think that people were initially always talking about the finance, which was the big issue, but that has sort of evolved, and also already from day one it was clear that it was basically 5 major challenges that we've seen in MSMEs. The first one is really the unprecedented uncertainty. So nobody is really able to predict what is going to happen, and that's not good for business. Then there has been a huge change in the demands in the market. So people has been the movement of the migration of people or the remigration of people. So the disruption of the workforces. The fourth one has been that stocks have been laying idle for quite a long time, a decade over time, and upon startup there have been some unfortunate accidents, related issues. And then as a fifth one, and I mention it as a fifth because it's perhaps the found to be disruption of the supply chain. And the disruption of the supply chain has been really one thing which started started before the lockdown. So I think who has been most affected, the first ones affected were the automotive and other industries which were really reliant on the imports of parts or specialized parts from China. China was the first country to lock down, and that was the early impact. Later on, I guess that everyone was.
Sorry to interrupt. I think your connection might be going in and out a little bit. Is everyone else able to hear?
I can hold it a bit closer. Is it better?
Yes.
Okay, then I hold it close. It looks a bit silly, but we managed the technology work. So I think that the automotive and electronics and parts and pharma were affected because of the lacking inputs and the specialized supplies from China. I think that now we see that the early sectors to recover were probably food processing and the associated ones, which was largely because we had a pretty good boom across India. The early recovery has been around food processing and also associated with that agriculture sector, tractors. So now I think that we are seeing that we are in unlock 5. We are 4 or 5 months in unlocking. We saw initially very slow takeoff. Now we've seen that there are some sectors which are providing a little bit of a pull or recovery, early signs of recovery, and those are the ones related to mobility, so bicycles, two-wheelers, small cars, tractors. So there is a demand for those products because of the disruption of public transport and unlikely to resume its importance, which of course has its negative ramifications for the green agenda. And then I think the other sector which has been quite good, I already mentioned that the kind of the food related. And then the third one which we see there is some anecdotal evidence, I guess, for and that is linked to the supply chain resilience, that international buyers are looking for diversification of locations. And some of that has come to India, away out of China by castings in India. For some other sectors, this has also happened, but I think still we had some conversations just in last week. I think that many MSMEs are still very much below their level of pre-COVID. They are at anywhere between 40 to 60% perhaps of what they were doing before, except for some of the other sectors. So I think that then maybe as a way forward, this is UNIDO has been emphasizing that we needed to basically bring the green agenda. We've been saying that basically the motivation for green has just increased because one part of it is that in economic downturn you cannot afford not to make it to take any efficiency gain. So if energy efficiency was profitable, you can't afford now to not do it. So that has been the agenda. I think there's also a renewed community interest that we have seen that the air is cleaned up, the Ganga is cleaned up. So there's more a sense of, particularly around the generation, say the below 40s, if I may say so, they have now for the first time seen clean air, clean water, and they have a desire to have this. And then I think that also, and this I maybe disagree with what you earlier said. This has been a big disruption, but many businesses are also saying, "You think this is big? Wait until climate change comes." So this is the scared off even the climate pessimists that if this small bug, so to speak, can disrupt supply chain so much. That's what will happen if climate change is really going to happen as it has been predicted. So maybe I stop here as a first introduction.
Thank you, Rene, for I think what is a perfect segue to the rest of our conversation. Early recovery signs, and I think I love what you said about people have experienced clean air and water and have that desire to continue. Since we're going to talk about resilience, and I had to look up the word before I came to this conversation. So I'm actually going to ask David if you want to give us a quick definition and sort of qualify the word resilience in context of what we're talking about today.
Well, good evening, good afternoon to everybody. If you have difficulty hearing me, just send a message so I can pick up if you're having difficulties. And thank you, Rene. I thought that was a very helpful categorization of the 5 changes that have occurred during this crisis, COVID crisis. And it does help us, I think, to consider those 5 categories quite separately. And as far as resilience is concerned, the word that the World Economic Forum very quickly introduced as part of the Great Reset debate, well, we should be a little bit careful, because resilience we would all tend to agree with. It's a positive word. Who is against greater resilience? And so you have to unpackage the use of the term and what it means. And in supply chain disruption, Rene's 5th category, what it really means is that we have found that supply chains that have been built to be simple, reliable, and as far as possible, as cheap as possible, have been exposed in some instances to be rather fragile. And so resilience means that we put in extra cost, typically, to provide greater flexibility in the future, to reduce the risks of supply chain failure in the future. And that isn't easy. And if you want a comparison model, I think, to link back to Rachner's excellent presentation on the work of the EU-REI in India, it would be the way in which the world responded to price volatility for rare earths about 10 to 12 years ago. It came as a surprise to most companies that rare earths could go up very significantly in price. And the reason for that was a gentle change in the supply of rare earths, concentrating most of them the supply from China. So the price went up, and companies who had abandoned supply from 2 or 3 locations found themselves with increasing prices and something of a shock. The response was interesting, because policy makers got very worried about it. There were lots of international debates, discussions, and indeed even now the EU has set up a new body to try to give regional security for critical raw materials in Europe. Whether or not that cycle continues, I mean, over the 10 years, what happened was there was a lot of panic, a lot of change, new investment, and then businesses slowly walked away from that issue because it appeared to have been solved, until it repeated itself again more recently. And perhaps we'll see this same issue about resilience, that we will resort to where business executives get rewarded for simplicity, reliability, and lower cost models, that we end up forgetting about these problems and repeat the mistakes that we are so conscious of at the moment. And I think that's a little bit of real politic into this debate, but you'll recognize that I'm speaking from the European Remanufacturing Council. And I think remanufacturing, firstly, is about taking back products and components to extend their life, product life extension, through an industrial process, so that the product's life is extended as if it were new. So that's why the process is at the highest level is remanufacturing. Then there's refurbishment, reconditioning at lower levels, but nevertheless, they all seek to extend the life of products and components. So what has the COVID crisis demonstrated for remanufacturers? Well, I would point to a number of interesting examples. The first one would be the way in which HP responded to the massive increase in demand from people who needed to work from home instead of their offices. And although HP for many years...
to you for just 1 minute here. We wanted to run a quick poll before we have you give us some examples. Would that be okay?
Yeah, of course.
So we spoke about efficiency and resilience, and I think what we want to hear from our audience now is, is it always necessary to compromise on one for the other? Because that seems to be the thread of conversation that's happening sort of globally, but we want to know what you think about it. So Naren, can we have the poll question up on, to build resilience, is it necessary to compromise on efficiency?
Yeah, coming right up.
Thanks. And while Naren is just setting that poll up, David, thank you for mentioning some of the scenario with price volatility for rare earths a few years ago. And I think, in fact, with the EV push in India, that's been the case in the recent past, and even more so now. Where are we in terms of material availability and affordability risks? And that's actually been explored in a fair bit of detail in one of the sectoral papers put out by the EU-REI, which I think Reva has put a link there on the chat box. And I think if you went in there, you'd find the sectoral papers that discuss these material risks at length. Naren, do we have the poll? Okay, so very quickly, we'd like you to tell us, to build resilience, is it necessary to compromise on efficiency? We seem to be talking about them as two very divergent ideas at the moment, but what do you think? Just a couple more seconds to go. I do encourage participants to answer the questions. It gives us a sort of an insight into what you're thinking, but we're not going to record your answers and do anything with it. So, please feel free to tell us what you think in those polls. Okay, so we've got about 25% of the audience that disagrees, which is interesting. But the second highest, then there are people that strongly disagree, which is about 15%, and then agree about 15%. Do one of our panelists want to take a very quick stab at that, or maybe we should go into some more case studies before we ask our panelists to answer that question? David, back to you. I think what you were getting at was giving us a couple of examples of how resilience has helped to mobilize these supply chains, particularly in the wake of the COVID disruption.
Yeah, my own answer to the poll would be it depends on the sector and the product. So I'm sorry, I need to condition my reply on that. But to give you some tangible examples that have cropped up. So HP were for many years very opposed to lifetime extension of products. But the way in which demand picked up so quickly, Rene's second category, that they found it difficult to meet demand, and the way in which they responded to that was to tie up with a company called Circular Computing, who remanufacture HP's equipment, and they marketed that equipment as new. So they were able to meet these change in demand by teaming up with somebody who previously they largely objected to. And then HP equally, I think when we look at the imaging equipment market, there are 4 different business models that operate in that market. So when you've got toner cartridges or ink cartridges for your imaging equipment, Some of those are simply disposed of at the end of life. Others are refilled, others are remanufactured, others are collected, smashed up for material recycling. And I think this period has been a great accelerator. All of those models, apart from the disposal one, claim to be part of the circular economy. But the big winner from this process, because of the changes to last mile supply chain disruption, has been the online model of delivering instant ink, as HP would describe it as. That model has worked very well because people were reluctant to go out to get supplies, whether they were remanufactured or brand new. So that worked better than other models. And I think when you look at those companies who had a office-orientated business model like Lexmark, they struggled because of the switch from office to home, and they have a remanufacturing model where the collection from offices goes back to a central place, remanufactured for distribution again. And I think that was struggling because of the fundamental business model of being office orientated, not because it was circular economy or not. So therefore, you have to be careful as to what explanation you're looking for. I would say that what we've demonstrated in the Great Accelerator is that if you wanted to build more resilience in for that market, then the circular economy's got a lot to say. And you would learn from some aspects of the circular economy to make it more resilient. HP has done that very quickly. And I think you could, for example, turn their ink model, give it more resilience by putting remanufacturing in it. So they weren't reliant on supplies from China to refill the supply chain to their domestically located customers. That's one example. I've got many, many others where I think the circular economy has been very helpful, and I think resilience can be improved, not necessarily by increasing cost, but probably by increasing complexity, which is probably just as bad from the point of view of most executives.
All right, thank you for that, David. And I think those two, I think that example and the counter example, depending on what point you want to, are very interesting because, you know, we're saying a circular economy model like remanufacturing is a great fix, but it's not panacea, right? It's not like, it comes with a lot of caveats, like you gave us with the Lexmark example as well. From remanufacturing, we're going to shift the conversation a little bit to distributed manufacturing. And Vaibhav, I'd love to bring you in here. These are some phenomenal numbers, and I don't usually remember numbers, okay? But 1 million face shields, reusable face shields in 49 days when the entire country went into a lockdown. Is that correct? Like, did I remember my numbers right?
Yes, you're right.
Okay, and how did you guys do this? You're not a business, you're a community maker space. How did you do this? And, you know, what were some of the, you know, the features of distributed manufacturing as a model that helped you do this?
Sure. Thank you for having me. So what happened is on the 23rd of March, when India went into the lockdown, everything was pretty much shut, as all of us know, and what we were all talking about. And so we at Makers Asylum were trying to figure out what we will be doing as well. And so instead of going back home, a few of us, 3 of us to be precise, planned to lock ourselves down inside Makers Asylum. So we practically just went back home, grabbed our bags, and moved inside the makerspace and locked ourselves inside over there. To be able to go ahead and see what we can do at the space, because obviously being around tools would give us more ideas and make ourselves a little bit more useful. Initially, we were thinking of coming up with online courses, contents, and those kind of things. But what very soon happened is that we started realizing and seeing a lot of things popping up in the open space, open source ecosystem across the world. Things like face shields, respirators, ventilators, and a lot of different products. So one of the things that really pointed us out to was the face shield, and this guy right here. And we started quickly designing them and seeing how we can make them over here at Makers Asylum. However, in most parts of the world, what was happening is that people were 3D printing them and sharing the designs. But however, what we realized really quickly is that 3D printing is a slow technology, and to be able to really get to scale and to be able to create these at a much lower cost, we should look at some existing technologies such as laser cutting or CNC machining, which is more readily available across India in most of the sectors. So we started quickly, we had access to a laser cutter, thankfully, and we quickly started making some designs and were able to come up with something like this in a few days, where we were able to, at night, go and test out at various with various doctors at their homes and get some feedback and quickly iterate the design to be able to reach something like this. And in a matter of a few days, maybe about by the 25th of March, we were able to come up with a decent enough design that we started sharing on our social media and sharing the files. This caught a lot of doctors and the government and also the police, and we started immediately getting a lot of requirement for these, which we were not prepared for. So what we did is,
good way. I think you
sorry?
should qualify. The attention from the police was in a good way. I think you should qualify that, because attention from police has a negative connotation.
In a very exciting way, rather, because being in the middle of the lockdown, we were scared of stepping out, but at the same time, we had like police officers waiting outside for face shields coming to us, and at the same time, this helping us distribute them to various hospitals. This is what was very important, actually, coming to the distributed side of things. What we started realizing really quickly is how badly the entire ecosystem, when it comes to resources, were choked in the entire city. So there were no shops that were open, no factories that were open. So raw material sourcing was super hard. The other thing, what we realized really quickly, is that transportation was really badly choked. So that means that no delivery services were working, no aircrafts were flying, no Blue Dart was working, nothing was working. So what happened is that we started getting this request from all across India now. We were getting requests from Bangalore, we were getting requests from Delhi, we were getting requests from all major cities across India, but we had no idea how we can send it to them. So we tried to send the first batch of face shields to Bangalore. And I remember taking a truck full of face shields and going to the Blue Dart warehouse, standing over there in line, and at night somehow getting them to them. And it still took them 3 days to get them, which was a very slow process. So what we immediately started doing is, one, we started releasing our designs and sharing them openly, everything that we figured out. Plus, at the same time, what we started doing is that started creating videos of how the manufacturing assembly line can be laid out at other labs and maker spaces to be able to start manufacturing them. While we were manufacturing them at Makers Asylum, and we had a volunteer base of about 20 to 30 people who were coming in and also living with us now at Makers Asylum. So from 3, we became about 20, who were all sort of quarantined inside this one space that was our fortress. We were able to also make phone calls and activate other people across India. And by the end of it, we had 42 towns, cities, and villages activated across India. This is everywhere from Jammu and Kashmir, Guwahati, small villages like Nanded, Bhatkal. We had Gujarat, we had Delhi, we had Mumbai, of course, we had the south of India, Bangalore, east of India, Meghalaya. We had Ladakh as well. We had Jammu and Kashmir. So pretty much all east, west, north, south of India activated and producing the face shields from a very diverse group of people, from anything from filmmakers to anywhere from doctors to psychologists to, of course, makers and engineers, all coming together for this one motivation towards helping out in their own cities and providing the face shield at the source to the hospitals. What we were able to do is that, one, we were able to build those connections and join the dots by connecting, for example, the foundations to the makers in the city who were making these face shields to the hospitals who required them by online, creating a platform where quickly we were able to capture the requests and pass them on. The second thing that we were able to do very effectively was able to share the designs and collectively across the cities, iterate on the designs quickly and come up with best practices that we were sharing constantly that were being used to be able to share them. The other thing that we were able to do was to be able to evolve in the materials in a very, very exciting way to be able to reach a very commonly available material that was available in all cities so that people could buy them at a very low cost and at the same time manufacture them using machines like laser cutting machines and provide them to the hospitals. To give you reference, we reached 1 million. The first 100,000 face shields took us 15 days to make. The next 100,000 face shields took us 7 days to make. Towards the end of it, we were making 100,000 face shields a day to just show you how this was exponentially growing. At the same time, the number of cities was also growing, and at the end, we had over 42. Sorry, you wanted to say something. I'll pass it back to you.
No. I'm just trying to sort of, put all that in some sort of a structure, because that's a lot. Let me try and summarize what you've said. It's decentralized sourcing, rapid iteration and experimentation with different materials to see what is sort of ubiquitous and also cheaply available, and using existing infrastructure, right? And being able to go from 100,000 face shields, the first 100,000 face shields in 15 days to 100,000 face shields a day towards the end. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. I think you're going to give us a break for us to digest that. That's fascinating work, and I think speaks to the potential of distributed manufacturing. I'm going to come back to you, Vaibhav, in just a little bit. I know you had a lot more to say, but I think I'd love to bring Manohar in here to the conversation. When I spoke to him before this discussion, he said, why are we talking about supply shocks only with respect to COVID? Why does it have to be reactive? What about the proactive part? And I said, I love it, so please tell me more. So Manohar, the question to you is, as the textiles industry, as one of the business as well as the textiles industry, what was the approach and what were you doing with respect to circularity and resilience well before COVID struck? And I think globally, the fashion industry, the apparel industry is being seen as one of those that has come together and banded behind the idea of circular economy. So we'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to share my thoughts on this very important subject, because the way fashion is being driven is clearly towards this end. Let me give a brief background. Now, about supply chain, let me also take the theme of the conference. I'll talk in two heads. One, about COVID and how the supply chain aligned and how it went a bit more circular. Two, how did the entire industry over a period of last a year or two, not even two, proactively started building a robust supply chain towards becoming more circular. Mind you, fashion is there for all of us, and it's a high visible media product. So, and we are all users about it. What happened? Let me take the first heading, COVID and supply chain alignment thereof. COVID did change a lot of things. First, it changed the way the consumers perceive business, how they bought, where did they buy, what did they buy. A huge change. But in various consumer insights, two things distinctly came out as really topping, other than the health and safety part. One, consumers were veering towards sustainable material. Two, they wanted their clothes to last longer. Now, both of this would mean a lot to sustainability. They also moved towards digitalization, newer categories, better care, and end of cycle was being talked. All this had now to become part of a supply chain, which hitherto was more into supplying what was asked, getting a collection as per season, getting it on time, going through some technical and some quality assurances and samplings to get it there. Now the supply chain became a clear partner to support the brand, which did not have much visibility on who will buy, when the stores would open. So there the innovation started straight away in terms of the supply chain getting into innovation, which is fast, which is nearby. I have seen a lot of such circularity principles being done, particularly in cotton here, where, just 1 minute, where people converted cotton fabric waste into cotton clothing, particularly masks and medical textiles, which became really fast. And this happened. Now, the brands also had another challenge: unsold stocks, out of season, markdowns, which is the biggest area for the return on investment, a big, big challenge. How did the supply chain align? Here, circularity went towards traceability, looked at what can be seen at various levels in the ensuing downstream supply chain, getting those areas of supplies aligned with the so-called immediate demand, getting fabrics and some of it in yarn form aligned with the current need of filling up medical applications. Fashion was kept aside. So a lot of things happened in COVID which related. To summarize, during COVID, there was a lot of MIS, absolutely live MIS flowing around, which helped everybody. Traceability went up, clearly up. The markdowns were to come down, how to look at what is there and how do we ensure that sale. Let me go to the other, which I liked when I talked to Pavitra, was about how proactively the supply chain was being built. When you talk about proactivity in this business, you have to see what the consumer again said. With or without COVID, consumers said sustainability. What was happening was an industry which was not really up there on sustainability. Just to see the opportunity of becoming circular and sustainable, 4% of all waste was coming from textile and clothing. 4% of greenhouse gases were all from this industry. 90 million tons was going into landfill. Hardly 1% was recycled. And the usage of natural resources was very, very high. When you talk about water, even one t-shirt had 2,700 liters of water going into it. When you see the cycle, you had greenhouse gases, which are 2.1 billion carbon dioxide equivalent. So everything pointed out that we need to be sustainable. And if you to summarize, the challenge was, one, how do we conserve natural resources in such an industry where the predominant fibers are polyester, next is cotton, third is viscose, the industry which I represent. Two, how do we reduce harmful chemicals in the manufacturing process, effluents? Three, how do we get the energy into manageable proportions, the greenhouse gases to reduce so that we are part of the larger climate change? Three, how do we reduce waste when we are filling up landfill and also filling up the sea with not so good material? How do we have an end cycle focus of all the entire thing? The answer clearly was we need to shift from being linear and become circular in our principles of operations. This was possible only through collaborations. And if I go a bit deeper and see which are the main business models which came into being because of all this, not that everything was new. You had re-commerce, which really is picking up. I can give a lot of examples as we go along, the follow-up perhaps. Rentals, quite an interesting business. India was doing quite a lot of it. That had a serious challenge because post-COVID, people had problems, but things are looking up now. It's come more to normal. Recycling really jumped. Now, recycling earlier had to do with more of getting a cotton fabric back as a cotton garment, and then seeing that they give the similar properties, which was not really possible. It was more of a marginal downcycling, if not a larger downcycling. We had polyester, which was thermoplastic, which meant that clothes to clothes could be made with polyester, but the focus was heavily on PET bottles back to clothing, which was recyclable. So recycled had this. In my industry, which prided itself on planting trees more than that is cut, that means giving a lot of greenhouse gases, the circularity was how do we get back clothing which are cellulosic in nature and give back clothing which are upcycled through chemical recycling. So we had post-consumer or pre-consumer clothing which could be worked at. And the fourth one was refurbishing, which happened. And all these models clearly gave 30 to 50% benefits on what was the need for the entire industry to become more sustainable. Without circularity, we are not going to have all what we have as a goal. We would have moved in some increments, but not transform the industry. So clearly, circularity of supply chain is there. But now the supply chain looks a bit different. Now, if you're going to collect for a brand, it looks good as long as they get the same MRP, same amount of sell-through of their garments, even if it is got back from consumer or manufactured from start through designing and seasonal cycle. What happens to the supply chain, which has to make the fiber, the yarn, the fabric, the garment? How would they participate in a re-commerce and still be profitable? That question needs to be answered by the entire industry. That's the work going on, because more of our work, if I am to say, is on recycling, because we see ourselves leading such activities, getting there.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And I think we'll see if we have an answer to that in this panel, but it might require a deeper discussion. And I think, Naren, can you queue up a poll question? But I'm going to bring Rashi into the conversation here. When we were talking about proactive, proactive is one thing, but, to have your entire business modeled around something, I think a few years ago that people were saying is quite challenging. Can you even build a reliable and resilient supply chain based out of recycled materials? How does that value stream work? And Rashi, I think Banyan Nation has done that pretty successfully, but obviously you had some impact during COVID as well. So talk us through, what are some of the enablers that allow you to build that reliability and resilience, and what might have been a couple of learnings from COVID?
Yeah. Just to reiterate some of the points that Rene and David already, we were impacted by the migration, right, that Rene you mentioned, and also as David had mentioned that simple, reliable, and cheap just exposes you to these shocks, right? And this is something we realized early on as a company, that we needed to invest a lot in building a model that could give us a very reliable supply chain, because companies like Unilever and Reckitt Benckiser and many more FMCG companies rely on us as a raw material supplier to them. So we need to have a downstream supply chain that is reliable. And the way that we do it is through technology, right? So all our field force is armed with a proprietary application that we built that helps us get real-time data on the quality of supplies that is available, on the quantities of supplies that are available, and the pricing of that supply that is available, so that we can manage that and monitor that in real time, right? So that's what it sort of took for us to create that, resilient, or invest in that supply chain even before this happened. And the way it affected us, there were some negative things and also some positive things as well when you're talking about recycling, right? So the negative things, so if we talk about the circular production model in general, the way we come in as an alternative to a supply chain that has global linkages, right? So for example, plastics comes from petroleum, right? So if the petroleum goes through some geopolitical shocks, whether that's bombs going off in the Middle East or whatever have you, that doesn't affect the supply chain for recycled plastic, right? At least in the short term. So at least in the 3 to 6 months following that price shock, you're not going to see much of a shock in the recycled resin supply chain. So the way companies that are our customers can build resilience in their supply chains is through incorporating this recycled resin, so that at least the short-term shocks to their main virgin resin supply chain can be absorbed by the PCR resin or the post-consumer resin, right? But I think these shocks have also and we've seen that more FMCG brands are now seeing this as an opportunity to create those alternatives to the virgin supply chains. But at the same time, what's happened also, as all of you know, is globally because of COVID and because of the demand for oil falling worldwide, we had major sort of decline in the crude oil prices following a major decline in the virgin resin prices. And because of that, companies, a lot of companies that we know of in North America and Europe have just folded, right? They just can't sustain their models anymore based on a recycling value chain. And and I think those are the kind of negative shocks that that we need to find a way to sort of protect ourselves against in terms of a supply chain. Like, how do we ensure that we don't fall prey to those shocks? And the way yeah, go ahead.
Rashi, no, I'm just going to stick with you for a moment here because I mean, we heard a lot about how the recycled plastics, that value, that piece was affected because of the falling oil prices, but you had a slightly different perspective about it, right? And I think what's important here, and Manohar to stress this as well, is the brand commitment, because your supply chain, a part of the supply chain to the brand, right? What are you seeing with COVID, with the shocks? What are you seeing with brand commitments to, using recycled plastics in their products?
Yeah, we're actually seeing the brand commitments growing, right? Like I said, because a lot of brands are now thinking about going circular, because the consumer is now thinking about going circular, right? So where you have brands that are very sort of exposed to the consumer, you see a lot of demand for circular materials because the consumer is now aware. But at the same time, the alternative uses for the materials, for example, that we make, other than packaging, are pipes or cables, right? But these are not industries where the consumer says whether it's from recycled sustainable materials or not, right? So we're not seeing a movement in those industries in terms of adaptation to sustainable materials or recycled materials. But so that will take some time, so it basically boils down to recycled materials, especially when virgin polymer is so low price right now. Recycled polymers will have offtake where they can get, where a brand can get ROI on that, right? So if I just give you a mathematical example, right? If I have a Unilever buying recycled material for me for even 1.2 to 1.3x the virgin price, on a per bottle basis, it's only 1 rupee extra to them from a cost perspective. And they're not selling the bottle, they're selling the shampoo that's in it, right? So that's for 99 rupees or whatever, right? So on the whole, it doesn't make a huge difference to their cost structure, or at least not as big, right? Whereas if you're talking about a pipes company, right, that's making a product, so on a per kg basis, if they're paying 10 rupees more, that's like 10% more in their cost structure that they now have to account for. So I think from that perspective, we have to see which businesses that, and the ROI there just doesn't come. So, because their consumer doesn't care about that sustainable materials in pipes, they're not going to pay that extra 10% more for that. So I think it depends on where the brands are seeing an ROI in going circular at the end of the day.
Thank you, Rashi. And I think I picked up from both you and Manohar earlier about consumer demand driving circularity. And that's actually the topic of our next panel discussion, consumer behavior and circular economy models. So stay tuned for that one. That's in a couple of weeks. But the points about digitalization, those are pretty well taken. And Rene, I'd love to bring you into the conversation here on, digitalization, Industry 4.0, and you work with the manufacturing sector a fair bit. How does that link to circularity and resilience?
Yeah, I think this is quite a complicated question because we need to understand what we mean with the Industry 4.0, the fourth industrial. And I think that a lot is hyped on the digital side of the fourth industrial revolution, bringing insights, visibility, and digital pair, this digital twin of manufacturing operations. But it's sorry, I should bring this closer again. I need a better headset, so sorry for that. But I think that with the real opportunities for the Industry 4.0 are coming from managing the new manufacturing technologies, which is 3D printing, nanotechnology, also advanced catalysis, which in part are developed by digital technologies, bring that together with digital capabilities. And then we get the concept of what UNIDO has now put, and some others as well, advanced digital production technologies. And then we get a hybrid, where we can really sustainability benefits. So it can then go towards circularizing enterprises, so bringing resource efficiency in enterprise, because we talk about circular economy, but circular economy basically goes much beyond recycling, or as some have said, circular economy should not have recycling. So the purpose is to design out, and with Industry 4 solutions, we can in part do that. There's some figures going around. Most solutions might be up to 30% more resource efficient, so 30% less waste or 30% less materials being used in manufacturing operations. But I think, and that David was saying that before, it depends very much on which sector, which case. And I think that also we can look at digital technologies to help us with environmental solutions, so create circular businesses, which have circularity or circular economy as their main business case. So there we see, for example, drones being used, or floating drones, to collect plastic from the air, or drones being used for replanting trees in areas which are not accessible. That is an example there. Or we have, and we can go to a very luxury example, you can take a recycle bin where you throw it in a smart bin, which basically selects them whether it's glass or paper or steel or can, and then sorts it out and compresses it and sends a message when it needs to be picked up. So I think there are many solutions if we go with remanufacturing, so taking out as well. So if you want to measure parts life and parts health, we might have to build in some smart chips so that we can actually monitor and track the health of essential parts of equipment, so that we can remanufacture. I see that digital technologies and then the Industry 4's transition very much as an enabler to get us to circularity in a broader sense of not just closing the cycle, but also designing out waste and designing out.
Thank you, Rene. I think that was very well put. I mean, it was easy for me to ask that question, and I think it was a complicated answer, but you did a very good job of helping us link those ideas. I think what we might want to talk about now, I'm just conscious of the time here, it's 4:20. Maybe it's time for a quick poll question. We've heard about, Naren, can you flash the poll question up? So just to contextualize that, we've talked about remanufacturing, refurbishment, reuse, re-commerce, distributed manufacturing. We've talked about principles like digitalization and collaboration, use of recycled input materials, right? We just want to get a pulse to see, as the audience, what do you think will have the most impact on building resilience into the supply chains? I think this was one of those questions where you could pick multiple options. So just happy to see what you think at this point. And also just a reminder to the audience that you can leave us questions that you want the panelists to answer, which we'll get to in just a few minutes. All right, the poll has ended. I'm going to wait for the results to come up because I just love to see what everyone's thinking at the moment. Okay, when there are like more than 4 options, I have trouble telling what's the highest number. It reflects very poorly on me. But I think what we're seeing is 39% of the audience telling us that collaboration is what is going to create the most impact. And I see our panelists nodding here a little bit. Well, sort of equally followed by remanufacturing, digitalization, and the use of recycled input material. Do our panelists want to comment on that? Are there any perspectives you'd like to add to that, particularly on collaboration? Collaboration being a key to building resilience, or even a couple of the other aspects.
Yes, I think I can tell from our experience that the way we built our company was collaboratively with the brands that we sell to, right? So because as a small company in recycling, it was difficult for us to understand how the giants like FMCG companies like Unilever or Reckitt or Shell or Castrol, how they work. So collaboratively to get into their boardrooms and understand how their supply chains work, what are their challenges to going circular. I think that really is how we got to where we are today. And so definitely that's a big that's a key ingredient to going circular. And we see the feedback that we give to companies goes into their design process. So a lot of the recyclers today can't deal with all the metal springs that come in the bottles that come with pumps, and that's a feedback that we've been consistently giving all the brands, and a lot of the brands have now acted and they're phasing out the pumps with the metal springs that make it very difficult to recycle. And they're moving on to different bottle designs. So designing for circularity, and that only happens when you work collaboratively with those enabling the circular economy.
Thank you, Rashi. And I love that you brought up the pumps example, because I think what we saw when the demand for hand sanitizers and liquid soap went up, that one of the areas that was a real challenge for the FMCG companies, it wasn't so much the plastic that went to making the bottle, it was the pumps, which were very difficult, right? So by design, to make it easier to recycle, if you're going to get rid of pumps, that also directly feeds back into easier sourcing for you when it comes to making your bottle. So love how that's connected. Any more thoughts on collaboration? I think I might want to move to one other question before we wrap up for the day.
I'm happy to share if you have a few minutes.
Yes, definitely, Vaibhav. Go ahead.
Sure. So again, I completely resonate with collaboration because that's what our space is all about. If you look at it, for example, with the face shields as well, the way that we were able to scale up to the million in a matter of 49 days would not have been possible without collaboration. The way that we were able to build that collaboration network to be able to grow that. Another thing that I would like to point out is sustainability is very important. And because of the collaborative nature, the ideas that were coming in not just from one city, but across the country, or actually across the world, I would rather say, because these face shields also were made in the United States and in Kenya and in Australia. The same design were being added on. We were able to share on best practices on how to reduce waste and use better ways to be able to reuse them, and at the same time, how to, these are biohazards at the end of the day, how do you degrade them at the end? The other thing that I would like to point out over here, same nature of collaboration, but only were we able to make face shields, but we were also working on a lot of different because of this network. One of them being active respirators. We've made over 75 of them. We're reaching about our first 100. These are sort of meant for doctors. It provides the doctors direct access, direct filtered air straight to their hoods with a filtration unit at the back with the blower unit. But now, thanks to open source, collaborative nature, and a distributed manufacturing line, we're able to share ideas with people across the world and innovate on these at a much, much, much rapid way to be able to create these right here, and at the same time made a much better design, which we feel a taste to what's existing, and at the same time reduce the cost to almost 1/7 of what they're actually available at in any part of the world. Another one of the problems the world is facing currently at a very, very big way around COVID is around oxygen concentration, oxygen generators, because of the huge lack of oxygen generators that are there in hospitals in countries like India, Africa, Afghanistan, Middle East, everywhere. And I think this is the ongoing debate a lot in the open source communities right now and in the maker spaces across the world, which is to come up with newer designs for oxygen generators that could generate oxygen at the source at the hospital to be able to provide to the patients. This is another project that we're working on with maker spaces and institutions across the world, and the once again collaboration and openly discussing these ideas across the world in a digital manner and sharing these digital files very easily and using them has made this all possible.
Right. Excellent thoughts there, Vaibhav. And I think rapid collaboration, if I can use that term, at scale, is what has made so much of your work possible, right? And I think what COVID has actually done is provided like the perfect test bed for distributed manufacturing, because we've seen examples from across the world, and it's like, here's proof of concept for distributed manufacturing, which people were questioning in terms of, is it reliable? What about counterfeits? How do you assure quality? And I think a lot of these we can't get into right now, but have been answered, because we're talking about not a plastic bucket. We're talking about respirators. We're talking about PPE, which are very, very vital. So, and if we can do it in health and medical equipment, we should be able to do it across products and across sectors, right? Okay, great. Thank you so much for that, Vaibhav. If there's not much else on collaboration, I think the last question I have for the day, and I don't see too many audience questions, but my sort of last question for the day is, what is the trade-off, right? Because businesses want a business case now in the short term, right? What is the trade-off? Have businesses started thinking differently about it? Where are we with respect to this? I'm going to sort of just open it up to all the panelists, whoever wants to comment on this. We've got 2 or 3 minutes, I think, left. I always see awkward silence when I don't mention panelists' names, and I realize that that's just everyone being polite. Okay, so
I mean, I can take a stab at that. I think at the end of the day, we have to think about the long-term impact of consumption. And until we have businesses still reporting quarterly results that are driven by quarterly investor expectations, I think that's going to significantly change. So businesses have to think about the long-term impact of the cheap product, the perceivedly cheap product that we make, right? So we have to bake into the cost of the product the long-term impact that it has, the resources that are there, right? So when we create a product, we should think about how much is it going to cost to recover the shampoo that is going to get in the water streams? How much is it going to cost to recover the packaging that's going to enter the landfill, and bake that into the cost of the product? And until we start doing that, I think that is the trade-off in my mind.
Thank you, Rashi. Does anyone else want to weigh in? Rene, I think I'd be interested in hearing this, particularly from the perspective of SMEs, because they don't sort of we think they don't have this the afford to think in a more long-term manner. How are you looking at the trade-offs, and particularly the financial ones that might come from having to build resilience at the moment?
I think the jury is out on how this will work out. I think that because of the shock, people have started to look at things which were quite entrenched. So people never really asked the question: is my supply chain properly organized or so? This is the way the business was done, and this is also how we shop if we go for groceries, we take a routine, and that's also what businesses do. And if the routine is not there, they look for opportunities. Also found some benefits in there, in the sense that things which they were trying to get from far away turned out to be available next door or so, because of the not knowing what is happening. Of course, with by many businesses going then online, this has also enabled to find out basically who's having what where. So to a certain extent, the shock has created a panic, but has also created a bit of a reconsideration of the supply chain. And since you gave me the floor, I wanted to highlight one more point, which has come out in terms of collaboration. I think for the makerspace is a bit of an example of this. But we will see resilient supply chains, not just in looking at the materials, but also in bringing innovation and manufacturing closer together. So where you came in with the respirators easily together is because you could connect innovation with the manufacturing. That was in the past that cars are being designed in Europe, manufactured in Asia. We will see more of the integrated design, innovation, and manufacturing hubs emerging. So maybe some people have already said this notion of global value change, if it ever existed, it's up for a remake, as we might see for value chains 2.0 in that sense. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rene. Any last thoughts from our panelists?
Yep, I have a point here that in a fashion sort of business, the challenge would be to address consumption itself. If there is overconsumption, how would you be fashionable enough by having fewer clothing or going for recycled, or in some cases, like I mentioned, for cotton, some downcycling, and still be fashionable enough? That's going to be a big challenge. Most of it has to do with the entire supply chain delivering a new value. That value would definitely have circularity and sustainability included in it. Unless that goes into the hearts of each consumer, it's going to be tough to reduce consumption itself, because there's a lot of waste which is happening.
Very interesting, thank you. And we're going to pick up consumption and consumer behavior and circular economy models in a couple of weeks. So this is like a good segue into that. We just want to have a quick, we're coming up to the end of the session. We just want to have a very quick understanding of from the audience, if you thought the session was informative. Naren, could you just put up the last poll question, please? Okay. And if you also want to give us more elaborate feedback, Naren will put in the feedback form in the chat box in just a second. This is the second panel discussion in a series of 6, and it would really help us to improve the content we're bringing to you if we can get more of an understanding from you on what you'd like to see and what you thought of this one. So while you fill these in, I'm going to try and wrap up and summarize everything we've heard today, right? And I'd love for my panelists to, for our panelists here to just, tell me if I'm thinking about this the right way. So there's circular economy principles like remanufacturing, refurbishment, the use of recycled materials, which can directly help to build resilience in the supply chains, as alternative inputs or, diversification of your raw material sources, but with the caveat that it has to be done right. David had some excellent points on that. In terms of resilience building and circular economy, the other major link seems to be that some underlying principles like digitalization, collaboration, and we sort of touched upon this harmonization in the design of products, right? Can help you build these sort of three aspects: harmonization, collaboration, digitalization, are underpinning principles that can help you build resilience and simultaneously move towards circular models. And there's been a rather massive impetus to look at these principles more seriously at the moment. And I think what we're trying to say is, what I also saw coming out was, as you build resilience in the supply chains and move towards more circular economy models, the system as a whole becomes more resilient. That's sort of been my takeaway. I'm not sure if I've missed something out. I hope not, but there was like a lot to run through in this session. Please do share your feedback with us. Any last comments from our panelists, if you would like to, or if Rachna, you want to mention something. If not, those were sort of my final thoughts. Please do follow us on, sorry, I'm going to pause here for a second in case anyone wants to say anything. Okay, not much sign of that. Okay, thank you to the audience. I love the discussion that's gone on. I will hopefully be able to read through some of these comments and plug them into the insights that we're developing. We're not going to just leave you with, here's like 12,000 things we talked about. We're going to compile all of this into some insights and share that with you as well on email and social media. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. I hope you answered the question on whether you found the session informative, and please give us more extensive feedback using the link there. I think we're all done. Thank you so much to the panelists. I know you have so much more to say, but we're running short of time. Thank you so much for this absolutely wonderful discussion. Thank you to the audience for keeping things interesting for us. And thank you, Rachna and Reva and the EU-REI project for helping us put this together.